She was humbled. She was grieved, though she hardly knew of what. Jane Austen's exquisite, deeply powerful, and exacting novel of manners, Pride and Prejudice, first published in 1813, takes us past the signs and forms of typical romance among the lower gentry and into the exalted depths and throes of psychological realism. In we go. One can't help but look out from the pages of Pride and Prejudice into the contemporary world, and for the paltriness of its collegiality and the overabundance of its coarsity, find it lacking, find it morally lacking, and thus thrumming at a much less exuberant frequency. Now, this point may be assailed and countered by apologists for our current moral and social flaccidity, but its thrust, in my view, will remain true. In our interpersonal relations, in group settings, in our public attitudes, and lack of conviviality, there's been a great coarsening. And yet, Jane Austen's work, over 2 centuries after her death, reveals something downright redemptive about the potential for human understanding, in part because it's so thoroughly laced with good humor. The author's loving and winking voice strongly suggests that perhaps if we were to re-imbue our cocktail parties, our coffee dates, our social lives, in short, with a degree of gentle circumspection, of renewed decorum, good taste, common decency, in other words, with a recognition of the human dignity of our fellow travelers, then we might, in fact, rather than be constricting ourselves to no advantage, we might be having a great deal more fun. Of course, this would require an imagination for what the marvelous poet Adrian Rich once called the dream of a common language. Pride and Prejudice's opening sentence is famous, axiomatic, certainly comedic, and voiced with a perspective that, in today's world, might be taken as something of a provocation. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. While this simple, if somewhat glib assertion might have appeared true enough on the face of it, the fact of having to point this out, coupled with its egregious placement as the opening line of the book, immediately introduces both comic and comedic effects into what at first might look like a time-old tale of wooing and wedding. One comic effect that is to be inferred by the claimed universality of this apparent fact is that we all know that things never just go one way, do they? Let's compare the opening line of Pride and Prejudice with the opening line of Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, which will be published 65 years later and which shares several key commonalities. First, Jane Austen again. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now, to the opening of Leo Tolstoy's supreme masterpiece, the novel Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. We might almost presume to know these books without having read them. They are so much, even in our latter-day age, part of the firmament, indeed the inner atmosphere of the literary and cultural welkin. Our films and shows draw deeply from their schemes, their characterizations, and their value judgments. And as generations before have done, we often hanker for the pre-industrialized past, probably just as frequently as we hanker for a glimpse of the dystopian far future. Such books as Pride and Prejudice, or Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, or Flaubert's Madame Bovary, or James Joyce's Ulysses, we might seem to know these books, to be close to them, perhaps even to have thumbed their pages in a favorite bookstore. But upon actually beginning them, upon matching our soul's inner temperament to the delicious call of the pages and embarking on the journey, we encounter not the stolid marble museum piece we may have expected, reading for the edification only a declaimed classic can deliver. No, quite to the contrary. We find there an intimate, dynamic work of art, fashioned by a once living hand and suffused, therefore, with a breathing, feeling human spirit at the height of its earthly powers. That the Miss Lucases and the Miss Bennets should meet to talk over a ball was absolutely necessary. There's a great deal of fun in Miss Austen's pages in having to ascertain rather than having to be continually bowled over with truth claims and emotive assertions. To have to glean and ascertain through the finely discriminating patternings of thought and word choice, as we do when reading one of Austen's novels, has the tremendously humanizing effect of sharpening the senses and rarefying the appetite. In addition to finding myself continually delighted with each passing paragraph, these are the things I think about when immersed in the narrative of Pride and Prejudice, as we see Lizzie's personality and inwardness emerging across the chapters. Which brings me back to an insight I like to share from time to time on this platform. One of the measures of the quality of the book you're reading is the quality of the thoughts you have in between the lines, as it were, while you are reading it. This is the algorithm of deep reading. It's the force multiplying function that occurs when we allow our minds the opportunity to free associate within the parameters of reading a great text. Words are portals into an author's preoccupations and, one might say, sense and sensibility for how the social world is constructed. Tolerable and intolerable is one such word. It peeks its head to important effect throughout the pages of Pride and Prejudice. Another word, which I might call from the bouquet of delectable word flowers which Austen employs, is supercilious. Supercilious means coolly and patronizingly haughty, and when we hear this word, it puts us into the free, indirect discourse of Lizzie's mind and opinions. Now, that occurs not in the dialogue, but in the narrative flow of the paragraphs. And we come to find out how she considers the others in her company, and how, like her literary ancestor Rosalind, who pals around with the clown Touchstone, or like the far later and in a slightly different register character, Holden Caulfield, Elizabeth is at heart a social alchemist, concerned with testing the metal and quality of every human substance she encounters, wary of devoting herself to what we might call fool's gold. This is not Charlotte Bronte's Yorkshire. Far less is it Louisa May Alcott's New England. One element of life that Austen's narrative brings to the front of our consciousness is a particular question about identity and good conscience when it comes to dedicating one's life to a marriage. Whether the value in primary consideration is the continuance of the family line as such, and all the qualities and loyalties attendant therein, its history, character, the actual properties, and its spirit, all that considered on the one hand, and on the other, to what degree of responsibility a young woman who has been shown to the world should be held to when considering whether by good fortune or the application of diligence and sacrifice, that family line and those family properties, holdings, and personal qualities should advance themselves into a subsequent generation. In other words, what's in it for me? Do we make these choices in a kind of group mind, as it were, with our mother and father, sisters, relations, and friends weighing in? Well, what about our own personal inwardness and desires, our own satisfaction and interest, a little divine chemistry, the seeds of love, in short, not merely the ancient family love engendered by a sound match, but the sparks of love when soul recognizes soul that the troubadours might have sung about in, say, the olden language of Provençal. Austen raises a question that casts its shadow into our more fractious times. Do we ever make such choices purely of our own account? We might not have to search long to find the exception that proves the rule. What are the inputs inherent in both sets of choices? What is the calculus for arriving at a decision that might both quiet the family's nerves while positively inflaming our own spirits? These questions were made more and more explicit in Austen's time and memorialized poignantly in her novels. If there were one Shakespearean play this novel reminds me of, ultimately it's not As You Like It, it's Twelfth Night, because it's just downright zany, especially as the novel progresses. At the opening, the eldest Miss Bennet, Jane, is the subject of a potential matrimony, but it's the unashamed Lydia, the youngest of the five, who scandalously becomes the first to marry. In all this domestic push and shove, where do one's responsibilities lie? This rather gets at the heart of Austen's thematic interest. Austen's imaginative world, a glorious comedy though it may be, reflects the fact that, as in life, the matrix of decisions regarding relationships, family, children, parents, and inheritance is all vastly reformulated when you have skin in the game. It would be one thing entirely to evaluate these choices on a blackboard in an academic setting. But when you are the young woman in the arena, the ropes and pulleys of interpersonal need tug all the more tautly. And a great novel, we might say, is nothing less than a deep study of the character and temperament of the principal players as they interface with, navigate, and ultimately resolve upon some answer, imperfect or incomplete as it may inevitably appear, to those perennial questions that this, our life, poses. As Jane Austen writes, putting these words into the mouth of Elizabeth Bennet's closest friend Charlotte Lucas, "Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. If the dispositions of the parties are ever so well known to each other, or ever so similar beforehand, it does not advance their felicity in the least. They always continue to grow sufficiently unlike afterwards to have their share of vexation, and it is better to know as little as possible the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life." You make me laugh, Charlotte, but it is not sound. We must be careful to understand that this may not reflect the views of the author as such. Rather, the author is fully conscious of the variety of views prevalent and allows her characters to take on these viewpoints, to interact with them in a dynamic, albeit largely domestic, landscape, and to be in some cases profoundly altered by them. Charlotte's eventual marriage to Mr. Collins reflects her personal worldview and is much in line with both her station, temperament, and with the relative degree of brightness that the beacon of her personal attractiveness may shine into the precincts of Hertfordshire, Kent, and beyond. From the lovely volume A Portrait of Jane Austen by David Cecil. There are novelists, Charlotte Bronte and Proust are examples, whose books are largely autobiography. They employ the novel form, he to analyze his experiences, she to unburden her heart, and both in a manner so little disguised that we are justified in using their books as evidence when investigating their life stories. But not all novelists are thus self-inspired. There is another kind whose eyes are turned not inwards but outwards. It is what they observe in the world outside which stimulates their creative impulse. Scott and Trollope are examples of this type of writer, and so also and outstandingly is Jane Austen. Another of Miss Austen's true gifts is that for the delicate management of subtext. That is to say, of the implicit, concurrent conversation, usually of primary importance, happening underneath the actual words of dialogue that are being spoken. It's kind of a reading in between the lines. For example, when Elizabeth and Darcy are both visiting Kent, and he comes unannounced to visit Elizabeth at the parsonage where Mr. Collins and Charlotte now live, although they exchange but slight understanding through their overt speech, it is not only the fact of his presence, but the weight of their communal silences and the tonal contours of their word choice and phrasing that produce a new lexicon of understanding between them and develop, one might say, a set of signals that rise up into the air above their heads, into the afternoon sky where it colors the clouds like feuding angels. Thus much the business is. But once we arrived at Darcy's letter near the top of Volume 2, we bear witness to what a sublime Fabergé egg Miss Austen has really created. The patternings were not happenstance, but wrought with the utmost acuity and care, so that along with Elizabeth, as our new understanding is shaped by the pages of the letter, we cast a backward, retrospective glance across all earlier events and find a proto-Rashomon effect, where all the information and clues we've gathered into our conception of the scene must be shattered and reassembled. Such it is with Elizabeth's mind, and with her heart as well, though the former certainly precedes the latter, it's not far off. Such squeamish youths as cannot bear to be connected with a little absurdity are not worth a regret. Then, at the opening of chapter 29, we're walloped with what we've been waiting for, a stark insight and admission to the marital dynamic between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Though we've already been quite attuned to this frequency of domestic misalignment, if not precisely conflict, and have been given numerous examples, mostly comic, of the difference in temperament and gravitas between husband and wife, yet with this laying bare of facts, a kind of modernizing rupture happens in the novel, a kind of break with a mythic or fairy tale past in favor of psychological realism, which makes the book feel rather cogent and strong as corded steel, as capable as steel is of conducting cold as it is of the already apparent heat. An excerpt to this point. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty, and that appearance of good humor which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. But Mr. Bennet was not of a disposition to seek comfort for the disappointment which his own imprudence had brought on, in any of those pleasures which too often console the unfortunate for their folly or their vice. He was fond of the country and of books, and from these tastes had arisen his principal enjoyments. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted than as her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. This is not the sort of happiness which a man would, in general, wish to owe his wife, but where other powers of entertainment are wanting, the true philosopher will derive benefit from such as are given. We'd never quite heard it in such terms before, and it is jarring, but the fact that these thoughts redound in Elizabeth's consciousness provides the supreme contrast to her rudderless, solipsistic, vain, and altogether unpalatable youngest sister Lydia. In contrast, Mrs. Bennet, on learning of the compounding woe of Lydia's apparent elopement with Wickham, tumbles into a kind of quixotic delirium that underscores her lack of grounded understanding and her permanent wish for, and perhaps unconscious incitement of, continuing foolish romantic drama. But Elizabeth is a special character. She can hold these uncomfortable thoughts in her own mind and can additionally step outside them to a necessary degree in order to achieve a greater perspective and an understanding of her own romantic predicament, and to consider what might be done to prevent another marriage such as that of her parents. The book moves with great celerity, as Miss Austen might say, from this point, since now we have a firmly and incontrovertibly established center of moral gravity. Yet this moral failing of the Bennet parents can never tarnish the hard moral core of the novel. Actually, it accentuates our understanding. The entirety of the novel, I may say with no small degree of confidence, is a delicious masterwork, a deft and delectable delineation of ages, moods, generations, characters, shifting perspectives, and what Harold Bloom would have called, and did, self-overhearing. There is an inevitable and inexorable indebtedness to Shakespeare here, for we enjoy the spirit of his Rosalind from As You Like It, and a direct play on the zany estate manner comedy of Twelfth Night, and shades of the dark loss which is vertiginous in the bustling Much Ado About Nothing. All of this is put together in Austen's tableau against the subtle threat of national violence evidenced by the roving red-coated militia, touring the countryside in case Napoleon's post-revolutionary France should grow more ambitious and cross the English Channel. But all this aesthetic understanding and psychological penetration might come falling down were it not for one central fact, which must be believed, in my view, if the book is to be believed: that human dignity is the central human facet, without which we are nothing. It's the understanding that human beings, while capable of great stupidity, are capable as well of great redemption and charity and love, and fundamentally, it's the honor and duty and calling to a higher self that provide the only adequate moral roadmap. Whether we marry or remain single, whether our house flourishes or falls into decrepitude, we may account only and fully for the rectitude of our own moral behaviors, the alignment of these behaviors with our ideas and ideals, and the practice of combining these together into a speech that best reflects the quality and dignity of our human souls. In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. In a character as intelligent and complete as Elizabeth Bennet, we moderns may be surprised that her sense of dignity is so absolutely central to her own self-knowledge. Indeed, for all her enterprise and keen understanding, Elizabeth is, as Austen takes pains to paint her, an innocent. And when she comes to appreciate the truth of Mr. Darcy's story across these metrics of understanding, and her previous narrative conception of Darcy and Wickham becomes permanently unraveled and rejected, she racks herself with contrition and remonstrance. She excoriates and upbraids herself and works to manage this information so that the truth can be shown in glimpses to others in a manner that will not overwhelm them, but rather guide them. And this torpor gives way to a slow clearing, such that when the moment matures to its perfect ripeness, love erupts from her like the clear waters of a northern spring, furtively, bracingly, then altogether undeniably and torrentially. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. Ironically, it's this self-same spirit of dignity and how it can cut both ways that should get us speaking about the title. Pride and Prejudice. In the first instance, there's the sense of an epoch shift between the arranged marriages of the great houses and the new, almost revolutionary spirit of romantic entanglement between two not merely consenting but inspired individuals. Elizabeth's row with Lady Catherine in the ultimate pages of the book speaks to this very hot-tempered change in custom. But more particularly, the title is a continual reminder of how our personal and familial pride can keep us cleaving to old prejudices and stop us from admitting to ourselves the given reality of our conditions and our aspirations that must be on the face of it true, and how our long-held prejudices can continually ill-inform our sense of pride and keep us obstinately from the destiny that would otherwise present itself happily before us. This may have been among the most pressing social and individuated matters of Jane Austen's day, and nevertheless, it continues to matter grievously in our own time if we give space a while to admit it. I think that's what reading is for, in some key sense. Speaking quite personally, I believe that reading Jane Austen brings out the best in me. I'm at my warmest, most devotional, most good-humored. The author's great wisdom, understanding, and care for both her characters but crucially for her readers, and her nearly unrivaled power of articulacy, I think of only Shakespeare and Milton as coevals here, these unique gifts help to expand my own vision in humanity, even if just for that brief week when her book graces my lap. For that, I'm grateful. I feel lucky, like I stumbled onto a private store of treasure that prompts me, like a child finding a patch of fresh wild berries, to try and share it with as many of my friends as possible. Thanks for watching. If this content should please you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. You know the drill. It would make a world of difference to me, and I'd be most grateful. See you soon.